I am not Matthew Buckley Smith, but you are listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. Thank you all for listening. Matthew is taking a break, a well-earned break for about a month or so. I mean, the man doesn't take holidays, so this is a very big deal. But before you delete this podcast in a fit of fury, let me reassure you he is in this episode. I'm just the one doing the intro. Before I tell you about the episode, I should introduce myself properly. My name is Alice Allen. I have my own podcast called Poetry Says, and I am a co-host here on SLEERICKETS. I have interviewed Matthew a number of times over on my show, so if you're missing him during his time off, go and check out some of those. You can listen to the first one we did, episode 158, when we barely knew each other and I interviewed him about his wonderful book. Episode 219, we talk about the mountain goats. You don't have to love the mountain goats to enjoy that episode, I think. Episode 283, we discuss the very questionable music choices that shaped our adolescence. And he also makes a pretty wonderful appearance in episode 237, which is about a poem by Australian poet Dorothy Porter. Has to do with Aeneas and Dido and all that sort of stuff. Today's conversation is one that I have been waiting months to hear. I am not just a co-host of this show, I am a fan, and as soon as this came up on the Substack chat, which is attached to the secret show, I was ready to hear it, and it was a pleasure to get to edit this for you. This is Matthew talking to friend of the show, Jonathan Farmer, about voice. What is voice for poets? How do we define it? How do we get it? What is this thing? Well, I think they do a pretty excellent job of attempting to answer those pretty much unanswerable questions. And I'm going to let them get into that for you right now.
I'm curious because we've talked a little bit about some of this for a while, off mic and then on the Substack chat a little bit and in person some. But I'm now I realize my own sense of what it is I actually mean has been so difficult for me to pin down that I'm curious what you think this is a conversation about, other than just some poems that were interesting to talk about. What is this in your mind that we're dealing with?
So my sense at the most basic level is that when you read some poems, you hear a person speaking. And when you read other poems, you can't hear that. And that's like a major demarcation between poems you can engage with and poems that are just confounding for you.
Yes.
And so the question then becomes so what is it that causes you to hear a human voice in some cases and not in others?
Yeah. And I think that's where so first, when people talk about voice in poetry, that is often used.
They mean a distinctive style.
Yeah, distinctive style. The crass way of putting it would be your brand or your shtick. Mm-hmm. But it, presumably it can have a richer meaning. Mm-hmm. I still have a hard time actually putting my finger on it, and I certainly have a hard time. My only sense of it as something for myself is not that I ever found my voice, but that other people at times have made observations about the kind of poem I write. I try to, as much as possible, avoid hearing those observations, but to the extent to which I have any kind of voice, it's something other people are observing. I don't know if you have a clearer sense of what people really what we're talking about when we talk about voice.
Yes. No.
Okay.
Yes.
Or no. I'm curious, your own sense of voice as a poet. I mean, you went to grad school, and conventionally, the thing people say is you go to grad school to find your voice, among other things.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's even really something that gets said much anymore. I don't know. But like, so two things that come to mind that aren't really answers to your question, but maybe give us a little more to work with. One is that I've noticed with students that in a really large percentage of the time, the kids who don't like to read don't hear anything when they read. And oftentimes that's because they've struggled with reading. They're just looking at words on a page.
Like they don't have an inner ear that's making word sounds.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's no corresponding sound.
Yeah.
And I think for some people, maybe there are images instead of sounds.
Yeah.
But that's pretty alien to me for the most part. What I see is pretty gauzy and not very frequent. So that's one thought. Just that for me, there does seem to be, like you've talked about, one of the reasons you read so slowly, but also I think one of the reasons that reading can be companionable and interesting and everything is that you do hear something, and it's not quite your own voice. The other thing that comes to mind is that when I was in college and I finally started reading poems, not just writing them, one of the first poets I got really excited about was Mary Oliver, and I read a lot of Mary Oliver. And then I went to a Mary Oliver reading, and what immediately hit me when she started reading was that she sounded like the voice I'd been hearing in my head, not having heard her read before.
Oh.
And like that may be just some weird coincidence or something I like made up in my own mind, but it's left me ever since with a hunch that there is some relationship, at least with some writers, between the voice they create in kind of the sense that you mean by voice, and something about their kind of physical relationship to speaking.
And just to put it as precisely as possible, when you say that her voice sounded like the voice you'd been hearing in your head, do you mean specifically like when she read poems you had already read, it sounded the way you imagined them, or beyond that when she talked or when she read new poems or other poems, that there was something consistent throughout that?
Both.
Okay.
Like it was like the way the pitch of her voice, or whatever things make up the like when you and I speak, I just listened to the episode that you and I did with Alice, and like when you and I speak, we sound very different. Like even if we were reading the same script, we would sound very different.
Yeah.
And so I have this completely unsupported hunch that maybe there is some relationship between some of the ways that we figure out how to put sounds and sentences and words together, and the way that we are capable of speaking. But that may be a completely bullshit theory. But maybe a different way of saying it that maybe is a little less likely to be bullshit is that the ways that we put words and sounds and sentences together has some relationship to the way that voice emerges. Because when we started this, we were talking about, like, if you were talking about the Dana Gioia poem that you sent, and you were kind of talking about diction, like you're saying she's wording this word's wrong, and that just ruins the voice for you.
Yeah.
And my hunch is that voice, again, in the sense that you've been using it, comes from more than just diction. I tried to read this posthumous Tony Hoagland book that I just couldn't get into about voice, and a lot of what he was claiming was really just like folksiness or colloquial qualities. That's what voice comes down to.
Right. Sort of like the Robert Bly claim that like all Americans today only have a low register, which seems not true and not convincing. I think that seems right. The Dana Gioia poem was "Pity the Beautiful," which is a friend of the podcast has remarked that this is, in his opinion, the worst poem ever published in Poetry Magazine. Which is
that friend Cameron?
No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Okay.
But I'll read it. I'll read it quickly. Pity the Beautiful. Pity the beautiful, the dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows. The hotties, the knockouts, the 10s out of 10, the drop dead gorgeous, the great leading men. Pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis whose luck's gone lousy. Pity the gods no longer divine. Pity the night the stars lose their shine. A few obvious objections to the poem being that that its argument is not actually that we should pity the beautiful, but that we should pity the no longer beautiful. And pity the beautiful is not a very sympathetic argument to begin with. And then my objection really is just that the diction makes it impossible to credit any speaker. That like there's no conceivable person who says all of these things in a convincing way. That this is somebody is putting on airs or putting on hipness. It sounds like a stepdad using, TikTok slang. Like it just feels like, oh, this is embarrassing. This is corny. Yes. That is, I think, one of the things. Right. I don't think that's the only. I think like thinking about this poem and thinking about some other poems helped me clarify that like there are sort of two things I look for that I have maybe been calling voice, arguably, neither of which is voice. But yeah, go ahead.
So I don't have any strong feelings about it. Like I just don't have feelings about this poem. It doesn't.
Yeah.
But I don't think this is trying to be hip. I think it's trying to use different kinds of mostly dated slang, and the poem feels like it's just a performance. So one thing I think maybe is a little different between the two of us is I wonder how much by voice you mean speech.
Yeah. I think I may even mean spokenness or speakability, some word that doesn't quite exist, some noun form that doesn't quite exist.
Yeah. So it seems it is that I am more likely to take pleasure and to hear someone speaking in a poem that doesn't resemble speech or speaking, in part because it seems like I can imagine other things that we do with our voices, including fucking around and showing off and trying to claim authority and literally singing. And so I guess for me, I still hear a voice, and it's not a super distinctive voice. Like I don't hear something that feels incredibly particular here, but I can hear a voice playing with words, not in a way that I find particularly impressive or surprising or anything. But so I guess what's striking to me, to the extent that it's accurate, is that it seems that for you, and I almost wonder if this has something to do with like the theatrical background, but like that to literally hear a voice. And there are plenty of like poems where I can't hear a voice either, but to literally hear a voice, you need to hear someone speaking in a somewhat natural way. Am I overstating that?
So not necessarily a natural way, but a credible way. And this is where like
But I mean, credible for what?
Like I could believe an entity would speak that way on an occasion. In this case, like I can't. So Ryan, the way, because I talked to him about this, I actually talked with Ryan and Chris Childers about this at the LCW conference, and Ryan mentioned something that he had learned from Derek Walcott, which was the way he put it was because Walcott was big on writing dramatic monologues, so he had them do a lot of that, and he had them like stand up on a literal stage and deliver them. And he said, you have to be able to say it without wincing. And what that brought to mind was a phenomenon that actors call winking, which is not necessarily literally winking, but if you say a line in such a way as to let the audience know that you know better than the line knows. Like you have to do it in a committed way or it won't work at all. Sometimes it won't work just because the line's bad or the play's bad, but like if you wink at it, if you kind of let the audience know you're not taking it seriously, that might get a momentary laugh, but it's a profound failure.
Yeah.
And so like the actor's job is to make all of it speakable, like make it all credible in a way that can come out of their mouth. But the writer's job, I would say, is to write something that doesn't force the actor either to wink or to have a like character collapse. And that's where I think there are poems that this is where I think like some of these poems that I don't think don't have speech or spokenness. It's not that they don't have credibility. Like that's not, I'm not sure how to distinguish these ideas, but like that's one way you can not have this spokenness. There's this other thing, which is maybe like a disembodiment, or like we looked at a Francis Levison poem, or I would say like Gerard Manley Hopkins in general, like very skillful poems with great control of language, but I can't imagine it's not, but I think the difference maybe is that nobody's trying to convince me that this is a speaker. And whereas here, I feel like I'm being told something I don't believe.
Out of curiosity, do musicals drive you crazy?
There are musicals I like, and again, I think when it works, like I don't mind elevated speech. I mean, this is the thing. Here's the thing. Like I always think about when people talk about an unrealistic, realism in theater and non-realism. No theater is really realistic, and when it is, it's like unwatchable. But like what people often mean is like notably heightened, speech, or one example of which is song, or speech in which people speak in verse or speak in a way that is not part of the rhythm of actual ordinary daily speech, which is of course like no real dialogue sounds like that. But to me, that's never felt unrealistic because I can always believe in a person. I can always believe in like some entity, whether it's a supernatural one or a non-existent one or a ghost or so. I can believe some entity would say this, some coherent entity would say this. There are then also plays in which the lines don't add up to a character. Like their lines are sort of broken against each other, and that's what feels to me like sort of profound break. I mean, it's beyond realism.
So I'm just kind of pressing on various sides of this to see if anything yields. Would it be fair to say that you want, or that you need, or whatever, that it's a kind of speech that imagines or that implies an interlocutor rather than just an audience?
It's hard for me to think of an audience as something other than interlocutor, like somebody who might respond, like somebody who's in a live conversation versus somebody who's, but I mean, I don't know, like maybe I don't make as firm a distinction between those two things when it comes to the speech itself. To me, like the difference between those two things is not a matter of the credibility or the texture of the speech. It's more a matter of the intention. Like, is this a speech that is trying to persuade someone to do something? In which case it's a different kind. It's a dramatic speech versus just being a lyric speech or narrative.
So, sorry, there's something you said just a moment ago that I was intrigued by. You were saying that like it's fragmented in the sense of like, this is kind of, if a person like X might plausibly say this sentence, a person like X might not also plausibly say this sentence. This requires us to then imagine a person who's more like person Y. And
you're right, like both sentences existing in the same poem become difficult to marry to each other. That can be the case, and that can definitely throw me off. But I also think like, so you sent this wonderful little passage from this book. It was a Robert Pinsky. Is it a book or an essay?
Yeah, it's a book of his. I can't remember what the title of the book is. I read this book so long ago that this passage is just kind of a given for me.
Yeah. I think it's so perceptive. I don't know that I even agree with his claim about Berryman specifically, but it's such a smart treatment of this subject. you want to just read like, we probably don't want to read the whole thing. Even the first paragraph, I think, would be like useful. Or if there's a section that you would want to pull out for, again, like I'm less interested in the specific application to the dream songs, although I do think the dream songs offer some good examples of some of this stuff in a way in which, for example, like it's not that you can't have like what was the thing that the Greeks would argue about whether you could have like disparate elements in the same work. Like part of the concept of a comedy was that it was not all unified. It was like it was like vaudeville. It was like a variety show. So my claim is not that like, oh, you can't have serious speech and silly speech in the same work. I mean, I would say like one of my very favorite titles in literature, period, is The Iceman Cometh, the Eugene O'Neill play. And part of what's so wonderful about that is that in the context of the play, the Iceman is a figure in a joke. And it's a joke about the guy who delivers the ice is fucking your wife. Like that's the joke. And so then to frame that, like it's these guys in a bar fucking with each other. And so to frame that with this elevated Elizabethan suffix, the Iceman cometh, it's already something silly. Then he's framing it in an overly serious way as if to make more fun of it. But then in isolation, it actually becomes menacing again, which it also is in the context of the play. So like to me, like that's a great example of sort of mixed speech that is able to bring in different kind of elements and marry them credibly. So would you, I don't know what's a good little part of this Pinsky thing to read, but
pick something that you're intrigued by.
Maybe just the first paragraph, stylistically, persona.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stylistically, persona or attribution works for Lowell largely as a way to balance meanings and allegiances in complex masses, in line, sentence, paragraph. As adapted to Berryman's meaning, the equally elaborate screens and attributions seem to free the poet mainly in the matter of diction, making legitimate particular words that in the single authorial voice might be too disparate or flat or maudlin.
Oh, yeah, and then maybe just the next little couple sentences.
So, though the syntactical eruptions of baby talk or minstrel talk may seem to have some particular special implication, Berryman's language seems to me to grow first of all from the poet's need for a vocabulary that does not restrict him or embarrass him.
Right. And that is true. Like if you read the dream songs, he does bring in, I mean, there's famously the one voice, the figure who calls Henry Mr. Bones, which is sort of like a minstrel speech, or a minstrel figure. There are also other voices. There's sort of Henry will put on a voice in a goofy way, self-consciously. And so these are songs that incorporate all these different levels and registers and modes of speech, but he's able to do it in a way that we can still not be embarrassed by, not wince at, not feel as corny, not feel like it has to be delivered with a wink. And to me, like I also think, like, interestingly, what Pinsky points out is like the goal, Pinsky's claim is that it's not that Berryman wants to include minstrel talk or wants to include baby talk. It's that the minstrel talk and the baby talk give him permission to then speak in what would be otherwise like a goofily elevated tone. Like it gives him permission for these Elizabethan flights of lyric.
Yeah.
And which I think, like, I don't know, but like it's a smart observation, smart suggestion, at least. And I think, like, to me, that is what poems that fail in this question are not doing, or like so like it's not that I want everything to be pure or homogeneous,
right?
But I want to be able to believe it. And then this is why, like, there is this other thing that, like, I don't know how much it overlaps with credibility, that is sort of mere spokenness or speakability. And like, I would say you want to read it's pretty short. You want to read As Kingfishers Catch Fire? Very famous, very celebrated poem, very impressive poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Yeah, I'll do my best for that. I adore this poem. I'll probably get tripped up at various points.
If you prefer, I can read it. I don't know what.
Yeah, that would be great. Actually.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Okay. This is As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerard Manley Hopkins. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring, like each tucked string tells, each hung bells, but bow,
I think it's bow.
Bow? Good Lord. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ, for Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes, not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. There's like, it is incredibly impressive. Like, this is not something even most very skillful poets can do. You have I think a lovely sort of breakdown of some of the language play in this poem in your review of Penelope Pellison's book. If anything, like I think one of my few criticisms of that draft is like you do too good a job of like digging into Hopkins and like you're like let it be a review of Penelope's book as well. Like there is an enormous amount going on here. What, at least to my ear, is not going on here is any speaker I can believe in. And here it's not, the problem is not as with Joya that I have to sort of wince or wink or like be embarrassed. I think there's another writer who talked about having to squint at certain kinds of art. I don't have to do that. There's nothing embarrassing about this. I just don't believe it. Like it doesn't feel like it's trying to convince me of a voice either. It just feels like playing at being a voice, a speaker maybe rather than voice is what I should be saying. That's not a game it's interested in, but that's sort of the game that I need as a baseline in poetry in order to care.
Yeah.
Like, make no mistake, I'm not going to pass over this and say like, oh, this is worthless. This is me. Like clearly an incredibly impressive poem, but it leaves me absolutely cold because I don't hear any speaker in it.
And so I don't want to try and persuade you that you should be hearing voices that you don't hear, because that's
Sure.
that's not a recipe for mental health. What I will say is that the speaker who seems present to me, the person who is speaking here, is audible to me as one who is seeking maximum delight in the ability to name something that has some urgent importance for him, and B, in doing so, to invest the transit from top left corner to bottom right with a maximum of potential pleasure and skill and movement, that it moves along that diagonal axis, but it's moving in all these different directions as it does, and to me ultimately making those multiple motions harmonious. And so a person who is credible to me, I guess I would say, is a person who is trying to perform his heart out. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that's not a character who comes across credibly to me.
Right. Well, it's not. That's the thing. Is like I wouldn't. It's not that I. That's why credibility is probably not quite the right word for a poem like this, because it's not that I disbelieve it. I don't think it's trying to convince me of anything that I disbelieve. I just don't. It's not that I disbelieve this character as in the Dana Gioia poem. I don't perceive a character. I just see the poet.
Yeah.
Playing with language. Yeah. Very impressive.
And that poet is the character for me.
Right. So a thought that occurred to me, and this will be a good opportunity to annoy Brian off mic, because or wherever he's listening, because I'll do some gender essentializing here. You can object as well if you like. But I think like a common distinction that is made about the ways in which men and women experience desire or attraction or arousal. Again, it takes all kinds. There are all kinds of people are different. I don't, but like I think there's an interesting distinction to consider as a possibility, which is that men seem to be often more excited by individual images, individual body parts even, and women seem often to have, first want some kind of context, some kind of story, some kind of persona, some kind of character, and I think like this is sort of the classic reason that like for a man, not that every man is the same, but like taking these sort of proverbial man and woman as figures, right? The man would at least be interested in a close-up photograph of a woman's breast, right? Someone he knows, like, oh, hey, that's nice. Very few women are actually interested in a standalone dick pic. In most cases, it's not like, oh, this individual body part is in itself enough to charge me with excitement. There is, again, whether or not that's any real woman, whether or not that's any real man, whatever, like that kind of perceiving, I think when I read poetry, I read as a woman in that way. Like when I hear people saying, no, I'm serious. Like when I hear people saying,
no, I
listen to the line, fantastic. Like listen to the line, bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Isn't that beautiful? Listen to what it's doing with the language. To me, that's like saying like, look how hot this dick is. It's so hot. Look at it in isolation. Look at it and feel like, oh, it's like, I want a story. I want a character. I want like, take me to dinner. Like give me some larger sense of an encounter that's not just individual impressive elements. Mm-hmm. I think that's sort of I think maybe that's like, maybe I'm too feminine a reader in that respect.
Really going to stick with that, huh? Okay.
It's proverbial. So, it's like feminine endings. Like I don't know.
Yeah. So like putting aside the gender thing, like which I get, you're describing a stereotype, and that's
yeah. Of course, it's a stereotype. Totally stereotype. Totally.
But yeah, I think you're the underlying point is useful. I think one of the things I'm wondering as we talk about this. And really, I'm just relentlessly trying to diagnose your taste, which is a shitty thing to do. But is like, again, like I think it matters immensely in a poem that there be something that charges the transit through the poem. A poem is, it's a sequential art form. You read this word, then this.
Yeah. You read it in order. Yeah.
It's not a painting where your eye maybe goes over here for. And I think it's fair to say that for most of us, for almost all of us who keep reading poems, keep choosing to read poems, part of what makes that appealing or worthwhile is that sequence comes to seem, and then the adjectives can vary, to seem meaningful, to seem charged, to seem delightful, but there's something about moving along that thread. And I think you and I are alike in that we both need to find some kind of coherence there.
You need to be on some kind of ride and not just sort of fumbling past elements.
And so I struggle when I can't get oriented in a poem.
But you can get oriented in this poem.
Right. And part of that is that the various motions that keep diverging in all kinds of ways from that motion and then coming back to it, the act of delighting, of the sheer cockrock of it, of somebody just taking utter delight in their talent and their ability to provide entertainment for someone else. And I have no idea if that's what is really motivating Hopkins here. But that's the feeling I have. The feeling of someone just driving this extraordinary car with just exquisite skill. That has a coherence and a momentum and a human presence for me.
Yeah. To me, it's like a car chase with no, like, without a story or a plot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just the car chase in isolation, which in the case of a car chase can still be pretty fun to watch. I don't know why I have like more restrictive tastes when it comes to poetry, which I should be more like, I should have more, I don't know, I should be more able to appreciate a greater variety of things, I would think. But
I don't know.
it just doesn't.
I don't think our aesthetic responses really submit to shoulds.
Probably not. Yeah. I had a thought, like maybe slightly off track, but I've like I made a, maybe dumb argument a while ago that like sprung rhythm is rap. That like the idea of having a bunch of, Hopkins was famous for, among other things, like telling you where the stresses in this line would fall because they are intuitive, and sort of saying, like, allowing himself to break out of a strict or even a loose pentameter and allow sort of the beats to fall in surprising places across the line. And that has never made sense to me, except in the context of rap, where rap prosody actually requires delivery as, like, not as a nice thing to give it an extra boost, but as like a structural element that, like, what tells you that a line fits the beat, that it's the right length, metrically speaking. What tells you whether it is or not is whether it can be delivered credibly. Like, if you can say it and it sounds like it has 4 beats or 3 beats or whatever, then it does. Like, that's right. And I think like thinking back through some of these poems, it occurred to me that there's another element in rap that has a similar kind of logic, which is like part of the convention of rap is that MCs say really outrageous things, make outrageous comparisons, make big claims about themselves, find ways of inserting surprising elements into poems in sort of a way that, and that is something that people take delight in. But I think just as they make sprung rhythm actually make palpable sense with this question of delivery, I think they also, like, the other thing you have to do if you're going to be a successful MC is be able to make your outrageous inclusions credibly cohesive. I was thinking, the Cameron will be annoyed because this is mainstream and not obscure anti-melodic, experimental hip hop. But the DJ Shadow song, Nobody Speak?
I don't think so.
You might recognize like the hook, but like the opening lines of that are like totally absurd and even like embarrassing and goofy. The lines are, picture this, I'm a bag of dicks. Put me to your lips. I am sick. I will punch a bear. No, I will punch a baby bear in his shit. Like first you have to sort of like make that fit a consistent, and he actually makes each of those a 3-beat line, oddly. But when he says it, it both is tongue-in-cheek in a way that acknowledges how silly it is and is convincingly menacing and dramatic and exciting. Like, the delivery makes it credible, not just metrically, but dramatically. And to me, like, that's something that I was reading a poem in 32 Poems where, like, I think most of the 32 poems stuff, one of David's refrains is that he wants poems that please the ear, the eye, and the ego. And I think that ego requirement, means in part that most of those poems do have a sort of a perceptible speaker of some kind. That's not always true. And there's a poem in there that I was reading today that doesn't really have a speaker. It does do a lot of sort of fun things with language, but it is much more of the kind that you were talking about a moment ago, where there are a bunch of individual sentences, and they don't, several of them in a row will not sound like the same person speaking. In a piece of rap, you can deliver that in a way that makes them credibly part of a whole. But in a poem, you don't have that tool at your disposal.
Yeah,
yeah,
makes sense.
So I tried to like find some examples that sort of are partial, like include some of these elements but not others, or like they're counterintuitive, or you mentioned Elegy for Estrogen, which is a poem I like and have talked about already on the private feed.
I wanted to mention that part just because it's a poem I'd already been thinking about, but it's a poem that I know you like that doesn't seem to fit into some of what I understand you to mean by voice.
Yeah, it is not, well, it's certainly not natural or everyday speech, and it's not, I mean, it's very unusual speech, and she has a lot in common in terms of her like poetic values with a poet like Gerard Manley Hopkins. Like, she is very invested in the raw sound of the lines, and she's skillful when it comes to that. For whatever reason, I find her poems, and this one, I think is, as you pointed out in your review, like maybe the most poignant in the book, or one of them at least. It's just a very effective standalone lyric. I definitely feel the presence of a real speaker, even if the speech doesn't sound like any normal human talking. To me, it doesn't just sound like a poet playing with language on a given topic. It sounds like somebody expressing a thought, a feeling, somebody expressing grief, which is the last line of the poem.
So, one thing I was wondering about when we were talking about the Hopkins poem is, and I'm going back to the theater thing again, like how much does motivation, like how much is that, like motivation in what I understand to be an actor's sense of the word? How much does that matter, do you think? Being able to like discern, because it's clearly not just that. Like, it has to be a relationship to diction, among other things. But maybe then motivation gets swept up, or diction gets swept up in motivation. That it would be inconsistent with a certain kind of motivation to, I don't know, use this word in this moment or something.
Right. I mean, I think that's probably part of it. I mean, again, the real standard is it convinces me or it doesn't, and then I can try to reverse engineer some criteria. But like, I would say, like, motivation, I would use that in a way that's closer to the way we use the word motive, which is like, when I say this, I want a specific visible or audible effect produced, and I want it produced by getting another person to do something. Like, that's what I would think of as motivation. There's also sort of like a not a teleological motivation, but a sort of an emotional motivation. Like, you're driven by a feeling to utter something, or you are hoping to convey to another person a particular emotion. I think, like, two elements that come to mind are that, on the one hand, like, I've met Penelope Pelizon, and she's like very charming and like a real person whom I've met before I read them. So that problem, like, it would be difficult for that not to have an effect on me, whereas I've obviously never met Gerard Manley Hopkins.
But you've also never met Shakespeare.
I never met Shakespeare. That's true. But many of Hopkins' poems, it seems as if the dumb guy subtext is, look at the world, isn't it marvelous? And I think, like, it's not even that, like, I don't find the world marvelous. It's that the person uttering that, at least in this way, always feels to me so unconvincing. Like, I think, to me, when I hear this, maybe this is part of it. Like, when I hear an argument like this, it's not like, what makes me marvel at the world is somebody telling me something about the world or showing me something about the world. What this seems to be doing is saying, look at how marvelous my experience and articulation of that experience is of my sense of the world. Like, it's not the world itself that I'm being asked to marvel at. It's his marveling at the world that I'm being asked to marvel at. And that I find completely unsympathetic.
Yeah, I get that. And I do think it probably matters to me that I take it, it's going to end up in a bad pun, that I believe the underlying faith is sincere. Like, I think one thing,
I believe it's sincere. I do believe it's sincere.
And so like there's something at stake beyond just a guitar solo in my experience of it. And that may just be because like I've been told he he's a true believer, and what I've read suggests he's a true believer.
What is at stake?
Um,
Like, I know he believes in God.
mhm.
That's definitely sincere. I know he loves language. What is at stake in a poem like this?
What is at stake
For the speaker of
is
this poem.
yeah,
We're talking about
it
as Kingfishers Catch Fire.
is taking what might seem to me, for instance, if I encountered it, merely pretty or ephemeral, and staking it to something profound and in some ways daunting enough that someone might, in Hopkins' case, forsake his friends and family and basic well-being for it.
Do you restate that, maybe?
Yeah, I mean,
Or,
and maybe I'm leaning too hard on biography, but I
sure.
do. That's part of
Yeah,
my
yeah, yeah,
experience
yeah,
of
yeah,
poems.
for sure, for
Like,
sure. Yeah.
you know, this is a guy who like gave up a remarkable amount for God.
Yeah.
He was disowned by his family. He ends up in a life that makes him miserable and leaves him lonely much of the time, that subjects him to awe and terror, and that even requires him at times to give up poetry.
Yeah.
And then this is on a simpler level, a person who walks out into the world and sees things that are pretty, and whose prettiness might be charming, but could potentially not add up to much more than that. And that he is like turning that into theodicy. He's justifying God through it.
Yeah.
And that that to me raises the stakes. It's not that I can't enjoy a poem where the stakes are low, but it's not unusual that I read a poem and say to myself, like, why is this person speaking, aside from the fact that they thought it was time to write a poem?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't I never for a moment feel that with this poem or with other poems of Hopkins that I love.
Yeah. I mean, he is not. I think like two things are true at once. Like, one is that he's not wasting anybody's time. Like, it is not a waste of time to read Hopkins. There's a lot to get from that, whether that's immediate enjoyment or something else. Like, it is very, very rich soil. I think the other thing that seemed true to me is and you know his biography better than I do, but like, this feels as if he wrote this truly not expecting anybody to read it.
I mean that I don't know his biography super well either.
What's going on, Ali? Okay, you want to sit in my lap for a minute? Come. Why are you holding this crumpled paper? Is that your comfort crumpled paper to go to bed with? Okay, all right. Oh, uh-oh. All right, rest your head. Sorry, what are you saying?
Yeah, I don't know. He was sending. I'm totally blanking on the name of his friend. He was, he was sending these poems. I mean, the reason we have them is he was sending these poems to his friend who was also a poet.
Okay.
They weren't tucked away in fascicles in the monastery, or wouldn't be a monastery, but I always wonder how much worldly ambition pulled on him, or worldly ambition was something he could partly transmute into religious ambition. I don't know. I don't have any actual idea.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. And it is, I would be, well, I think it's fair maybe to say that, like, I first read Gerard Manley Hopkins when I absolutely very much still believe in God and even was Catholic. And I didn't like him then either. but like, yeah, like this particular sentiment is it makes it especially hard for me to connect. But like, it's sort of a 3-part poem that's relatively long. But like, I sent you a Francis Levinson poem that I think is maybe more of a, it doesn't fight the conventions of speech as much as the Hopkins poem does. It's still very concerned with language and very, very, very skillful and playful. And it's nowhere embarrassing or winking, but it doesn't, I don't get a sense of a speaker speaking it. I just get a sense of a poet performing like a very impressive exercise dealing with sound and description. I should say Francis Levinson is also like a very good fiction writer. So it's, this is, I don't know how representative of even her poetry this poem is, but I'll just read like a few lines of it. It slops from coppery glass Dominican cassocks thicker than water, thinned syrup crackling and smoking over ice, pale as hearts of hazelnuts half caramelized or relics lit in cabinets, angelic alcoholic for kids, all quickening sweetness without the burnt palate. It's praline gilt milk chocolate. Don't knock it. Also, don't drink a lot of it. So like that there, I mean, it feels much easier to deliver as lines, as spoken lines than the Hopkins, but it also feels in a very deliberate way, sort of aloof from any situational speaker without sort of like fighting the rhythms and textures of daily speech as much as the Hopkins does. And then the Elegy for Estrogen very much fights those rhythms and conventions, but I hear a real invested speaker throughout, and it does seem to be this does seem to be a poem that is concerned with conveying to the reader some version of a real grief, and doing so as Berryman did, often while sort of like singing and tap dancing, like in a way that sort of is like never a drag. It's always sort of fun and playful, even when what it is expressing is a real sense of loss. Do you want to read this one, or should I?
You can give it a shot.
Yeah.
And I'll say to the Levinson poem, I liked it more when I spent more time with it. I think part of what limited me initially is just I found it really disorienting.
Yeah. She lists 3 nouns that have sort of unsettled, like the names that I had to either look up or think about. And then I realized that it is basically a poem of description of 3 sort of relatively unrelated nouns. And it's extremely skillful throughout, but it does seem to be kind of like a high level linguistic game.
Yeah. And I think that was the other thing that was a limiting factor for me. As you say, it's very skillful. It does sound very good, but I distrust the occasion of it, I guess.
But I'm curious if hey, Belle, let's don't crinkle that though next to the microphone, okay? That's okay. You can hold it, but just don't crinkle it. It's okay, sweet girl. Okay. Like for Hopkins to speak enthusiastically, and enthusiastically, maybe even literally, like as if possessed by a god, about this wonder at creation, that is more acceptable to you than somebody doing that sort of merely with language as language, which feels to me closer to what Levison's doing here.
I suspect so. I mean, again, I'm kind of doing what you did, where I'm trying to reverse engineer. The cause,
identify the feeling, and then try to
Yeah, and it is interesting to me. I wonder how much my sense of the kind of larger context in which a poem was written affects it. Like I can read a Renaissance poem where the stakes feel lower and the sort of linguistic play seems closer to being the only thing there.
Yeah. Even a lot of love poems from the Renaissance feel that.
Yeah, and take more delight in that. And I wonder if that isn't because I see that as kind of being a richer part of a social world and a poetic world and a world of artistic and interpersonal conventions.
That's funny because when I read I don't have a good example up. Maybe there is a garden in her face. Thomas can't like there's certain I don't have a good ready to hand example, so I don't want to try to cite one. But like there are Renaissance, often sonnets or short love poems that feel very much like as you pointed out, we can in a slightly different way. The beloved may not be all that present in 18, but in many of these poems, it feels as if like the beloved might as well be like a broomstick, like because really what this is about is how cleverly can I build a conceit around comparing these two unlike things. And to me, I have the same response to that I do to this Levison poem, which is like, boy, that's really impressive. You are doing what you are setting out to do very well. This particular thing is not a thing that snags my heart.
And it may be too that it's just it comes with a different. Do you say imprimatur or imprimatur?
I've heard both, and I don't know.
Yeah, Latin, it comes with a different one of those on it too, because it's a Renaissance poem that's showed up in lots of textbooks versus a poem that's part of this world that like it's so much easier for me to see as shallow and trivial. All of my stupid biases.
Sure. Yeah. But yeah, sorry. Do you want to read the?
Give it a shot.
Okay. Maybe don't pull the books off the shelf. Is there something you're looking for, or are you just looking to play with something? Okay. Maybe not one of the older books. If you want to play with the book, maybe just one of the ones that doesn't look like it might tear in your hands. Okay. You like but you kind of like the old-fashioned books that look like spell books, don't you? You don't know? Okay. Well, all right. I'm not going to worry too much about it. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Elegy for Estrogen. Without which the tits, anxious rabbits, sit up no longer on their haunches in the sun-nibbling grasses, but cower, fine, fat alertnesses pressed flat, who sense the raptor's presence. And the chin, ample in its sympathy, sinks down, laying the folded pleats of its old coat upon the lawn to lap the dew. Must the cunt, too, lament this loss? Atrophies dwindle once trophied glades, whose rivulets rinse the helmets of kings. What balm, after lush spring and summer's flush, fall dumb, to say wisdom will come pressing its cool cabbage leaf across my brow. Let all perfumes perish now. This insistence clocks can be stopped with resistance in salts. The one relief at a certain age is at last being sage enough to admit when I feel bereft. I've little time left for lies meant to anesthetize grief.
Yeah.
As I was reading that, I was wondering too, like comparing this to the Levinson poem on the one hand and the Hopkins poem on the other, if somehow the delight doesn't feel more credible to me. Like all three poems seem to be after pleasure, but for whatever reason, Pelizon and Hopkins's delight in what they're doing, and I mean in this case, delight alongside heartbreak and description of loss, but the delight feels more genuine in both cases somehow to me.
Yeah, maybe it's just that I mean, I'll say one thing because as we were saying, like this does not read like this reads less like ordinary speech than say the Levison does, although that gets pretty dense with its linguistic play. But it also is more like recognizable daily speech than I think the Hopkins is. Like the Hopkins I've read many times. And every time I read it, I think like, oh, fuck, what is he saying? Oh, Jesus Christ. I can't even follow what I'm talking about at any point. Whereas I'm never lost in the I'm never lost in the Levison poem once I oriented myself by like, actually the title I skipped over is extremely important. I'm never lost in the Pelizon poem either. But I think here, in a way that I don't sense, I mean, to me, Hopkins seems to be marveling at creation in a way that is fairly comparable to the way Levison is marveling at language. And I, I have a similar response to both, which is sort of a cold admiration. But the estrogen poem I'm moved by, and to me there's a great deal of play, and she clearly is someone who delights in language, but she is getting at something beyond that is maybe more personal than that. And I was thinking about some counterfactuals.
But what are the counterfactuals? Well, you have to listen to The Secret Show to find out. It is free for the first week, and after that, it is really cheap. There are over 120 episodes in there, so you're never going to run out. You will never run out of SLEERICKETS. I feel like, Matthew's going to hate this, but I'm the one doing the outro, so he can't stop me. This podcast has made me smarter. I'm not saying I'm particularly smart, but when I first started listening to this show, I could not follow half of what he was talking about a lot of the time. I didn't know any of the references, any of the poets he was talking about. Listening to this show and going off and trying to figure it out for myself has got me to read more, has got me to... Look, I hesitate to say this, but I think it's kind of made me a better writer. Again, I'm not saying I'm a good writer, but I'm better than I was in 2021 when I first started listening. And listening back to this, I was thinking about that in particular because this is the kind of conversation where, as a listener, I'm kind of like, wandering around my house, folding laundry, doing the washing up, and listening along and thinking like, what do I actually think about this? Where do I agree with what they're saying? Where do I disagree and why? And trying to answer those questions for myself over the last 3 odd years of listening to and being part of this show. I don't know, it's been kind of priceless for me. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And you can reach Matthew, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. But he is on holiday, so, go easy. Maybe send your furious emails to me at poetrysayspod@gmail.com, a much less cool email address. And with any luck, we will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.